The conference room went silent. Richard Henderson stood at the head of the table, his hand still raised from pointing at the door. His face was red. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're done here, Shayla. Pack your desk." Shayla Williams didn't move. She couldn't. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Around the table, 12 executives stared at their papers. Not one of them looked up. "I said pack your desk," Richard repeated, each word deliberate. "You've been too bold, too aggressive. You don't know your place." Your place. Those two words hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Shayla had worked at Henderson Financial Group for 3 years. She'd built client relationships worth millions. She'd saved deals others had given up on. She'd arrived early and stayed late, proving herself again and again in a world that demanded twice the work for half the respect. And now, in front of everyone, she was being fired for speaking up about a problem nobody else would name. What Richard Henderson didn't know that morning was simple. His decision to fire Shayla Williams would cost him everything. The $900 million deal he'd spent 2 years building, the reputation he'd crafted over decades, the company his father had trusted him to lead. But more than that, his choice would reveal a truth he'd hidden from himself for years. A truth about power, pride, and what happens when you mistake silence for respect. Because sometimes, firing the wrong person doesn't just cost you money, it costs you everything you thought you were. Let me show you exactly how this happened. 6 months before that conference room moment, Shayla Williams was living her dream. She'd grown up in South Memphis, in a neighborhood where dreams were luxuries most people couldn't afford. Her mama worked 2 jobs. Her daddy left when she was 4. Her grandmother raised her in a small house with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when you walked across it. But that grandmother, Miss Loretta, she had something money couldn't buy: dignity, strength, and a belief that her grandbaby was meant for something bigger. "Baby girl," Miss Loretta used to say, "you carry yourself with pride. Don't matter who tries to make you small, you hold your head high." Shayla did just that. She worked her way through community college, then state university. She studied finance while working overnight shifts at a hospital. She graduated with honors and a fire in her belly to prove that black women belonged in boardrooms too. Henderson Financial Group was one of the most respected investment firms in Tennessee. When they hired Shayla as an executive assistant, she saw it as her shot, not just to work in finance, but to show what she could do. Richard Henderson was the CEO. He'd inherited the company from his father, a man who'd built the business from nothing in the 1970s. Richard liked to tell that story often, how his family pulled themselves up, how hard work was all anyone needed. What he didn't like to talk about was how his father's generation had closed doors that people like Shayla had to break down. At first, everything seemed fine. Shayla was good at her job, better than good. She noticed things others missed. She caught errors in contracts. She built relationships with clients who specifically asked for her because she listened, really listened, to what they needed. One client, an elderly black businessman named Mr. Raymond Clark, told her something she'd never forget. "Young lady, you remind me of my daughter. Smart, capable, and probably working 3 times as hard as everyone else just to be seen as equal. Don't lose that fire. But be careful. Not everyone wants to see us rise." Shayla smiled and thanked him, but his words settled somewhere deep in her chest. Like a warning she didn't fully understand yet. The company was chasing a massive deal, $900 million to manage the investment portfolio of Clark Legacy Holdings, the empire Mr. Raymond Clark had built over 40 years. It was the kind of deal that would cement Henderson Financial Group as a major player. Richard was obsessed with landing it. He talked about it constantly. He assigned his best people to the pitch. He personally handled every meeting. But there was a problem Richard didn't see. And Shayla did. But just when she thought life was hard enough, things took a darker turn. The problem started small, like most problems do. Shayla noticed it in the research documents. The team preparing the pitch for Clark Legacy Holdings had made assumptions, big ones. They'd designed an investment strategy that ignored something crucial about Mr. Clark's values. Raymond Clark had been explicit in every conversation. He wanted his money invested ethically. No private prisons, no predatory lending, no companies with records of racial discrimination. His wealth was built to create legacy, not destroy communities. The pitch Richard was preparing did the opposite. Shayla saw it in the portfolio breakdown. She saw the private prison stocks. She saw the payday loan companies. She saw investments in corporations that had been sued multiple times for discriminatory practices. She brought it up quietly at first. "Mr. Henderson, I think there might be an issue with the Clark portfolio strategy." Richard barely looked up from his computer. "What issue?" "Some of these investments conflict with Mr. Clark's stated values. He specifically mentioned he doesn't want to profit from—" "Shayla, I appreciate your input, but investment strategy isn't your area. We have analysts for this." "I understand, but I've been in the meetings with Mr. Clark. He was very clear about— And I've been doing this for 20 years. Trust me, when clients see the projected returns, they care a lot less about the details." Shayla felt something cold settle in her stomach. She nodded and walked away, but she couldn't let it go. She knew Mr. Clark. She'd sat across from him in 3 different meetings. She'd seen the photos on his desk, his grandchildren, his late wife, the community center he'd funded in North Memphis. She'd heard the stories about how he'd been denied loans by white-owned banks in the 1980s, how he'd built his empire anyway, how he'd sworn to use his money to lift up, not tear down. This portfolio would betray everything he stood for. Shayla did something that took more courage than anyone in that office building would ever understand. She reached out to Mr. Clark's office directly, not to undermine her boss, but to ask a simple question. "Mr. Clark, I wanted to confirm your investment priorities before we finalize anything. You mentioned ethical investing was non-negotiable for you. Could you clarify what that means specifically?" Mr. Clark's response came back within an hour. Detailed, clear, uncompromising. No private prisons, no predatory lending, no companies with discrimination lawsuits. Period. Shayla took that email to Richard. "Mr. Henderson, I reached out to Mr. Clark's office for clarification, and he was very specific about—" Richard's face changed. The friendliness disappeared like a mask being pulled off. "You did what?" "I asked for clarification on his investment criteria. I thought it would help us—" "You went around me? You contacted the client directly without my approval? I was trying to make sure we didn't lose the deal over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Richard stood up. His voice got louder. "You don't contact clients without clearing it through me first. You're an assistant, Shayla. You set up meetings and organize files. You don't make strategic decisions." The words hit her like a slap. "You're an assistant." As if the 3 years of work meant nothing. As if the relationships she'd built, the errors she'd caught, the late nights and early mornings were invisible. "I understand I should have told you first," Shayla said, keeping her voice steady. "But the portfolio we're presenting doesn't match what Mr. Clark wants. If we present it as is, we'll lose the deal." "I'll decide what loses us deals," Richard said. "You need to stay in your lane." Shayla left his office with her hands shaking. That night she called Miss Loretta. "Baby, what's wrong?" Shayla told her everything. The portfolio, the client, the way Richard had spoken to her. Miss Loretta was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Shayla would replay in her mind for months. "Baby girl, some people get so comfortable being in charge they forget that real leadership means listening, especially when the truth makes them uncomfortable. You did right. Don't you dare second-guess that. But if you think that was heartbreaking, wait until you see what came next." 2 weeks later, Richard scheduled the big presentation. Clark Legacy Holdings, the $900 million deal. The entire senior team would be there, along with Mr. Raymond Clark himself and his advisors. Shayla spent those 2 weeks hoping Richard had adjusted the portfolio, hoping he'd listened, hoping she wouldn't have to watch this deal fall apart in real time. The morning of the presentation, she arrived early. She'd prepared the conference room perfectly, water glasses filled, presentation materials printed and bound, technology tested twice. Richard arrived with his senior team, all smiles and confidence. Mr. Clark arrived with 3 advisors. He shook everyone's hand warmly. When he got to Shayla, he held her hand a moment longer. "Ms. Williams, good to see you again. You've been very helpful through this process." "Thank you, Mr. Clark. We're excited to present our strategy for you today." Something in her voice must have wavered, because Mr. Clark looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes that had seen 1,000 boardroom games. "I'm looking forward to it," he said carefully. The presentation began. Richard was polished, confident. He talked about Henderson Financial Group's history, their track record, their vision. He built up to the portfolio reveal with practiced ease. Then he showed the numbers, projected returns, 12–15% annually, diversified holdings, strong growth potential. Mr. Clark leaned forward, studying the portfolio breakdown on the screen. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Can you walk me through some of these specific investments? I want to make sure I understand where my money would be going." Richard smiled, not catching the tone. "Of course. We've selected a mix of high-growth sectors. For example, we've allocated significant funds to the corrections and security sector, which has shown consistent returns." "Corrections?" Mr. Clark interrupted quietly. "You mean prisons?" The room shifted. "Well, yes, the private corrections industry has been a strong performer." "Private prisons." Mr. Clark's voice was still quiet, but something had changed in the air. "You're proposing I profit from locking up black and brown people," Richard stammered. "Mr. Clark, these are simply financial instruments. The returns speak for—" "What else?" "I'm sorry? What else is in this portfolio that I specifically told you I wouldn't touch?" Richard looked confused. He glanced at his senior team. Nobody spoke. Mr. Clark turned to look directly at Shayla. "Ms. Williams, do you have the email I sent clarifying my investment criteria?" Every eye in the room turned to her. Shayla's heart was pounding, but Miss Loretta's voice was in her head. "Hold your head high, baby girl." "Yes, Mr. Clark. I have it. Would you mind pulling it up?" Richard's face went pale. "Mr. Clark, I don't think we need to—" "I do." Mr. Clark's voice was firm now, not loud but unmistakable. "Ms. Williams, please." Shayla pulled up the email on the conference room screen. Mr. Clark's words filled the wall. "To be absolutely clear, I will not profit from private prisons, predatory lending institutions, payday loan companies, or any corporation with active discrimination lawsuits or documented patterns of racial bias. My wealth was built to create opportunity, not to exploit suffering. This is non-negotiable." The silence in that room was deafening. Mr. Clark turned back to Richard. "I sent that to Ms. Williams 3 weeks ago. Did she share it with you?" "She mentioned some concerns, but did she show you this email?" "She brought up some of your preferences, yes, but our analysts determined—" "Your analysts determined they knew better than I do about my own money." Mr. Clark stood up slowly. "Or did you simply not care what I wanted, as long as you could show me big returns?" "Mr. Clark, please let me explain." "I don't need explanations. I need partners who listen, who respect my values, who see me as more than just a signature on a contract." He looked at Shayla again, and this time there was something like sadness in his eyes. "Ms. Williams tried to protect this deal. She reached out to clarify my priorities. She tried to warn you, and I'm guessing she was dismissed for it." Shayla said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Mr. Clark picked up his briefcase. "Gentlemen, Miss Williams, I appreciate your time, but Henderson Financial Group is not the right fit for Clark Legacy Holdings. I need partners who understand that wealth without values is just paper. And I need people around me who have the courage to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. He walked toward the door, then paused. Ms. Williams, thank you for your integrity. I hope Mr. Henderson recognizes what he has in you. Then he was gone. The room exploded. Not with sound, but with a kind of silent chaos. Senior executives looked at each other, looked at Richard, looked at Shayla. Richard stood frozen for a long moment. Then he turned to Shayla, and that's when he said the words that would destroy him. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, something incredible happened. This is your fault. Richard's voice cut through the silence like broken glass. Excuse me? Shayla couldn't believe what she was hearing. You went behind my back. You contacted the client directly. You undermined my authority, and now you've cost us the biggest deal in this company's history. Shayla's shock turned to something else, something she'd been holding back for 3 years. I tried to save that deal, she said, her voice steady. I tried to warn you that the portfolio didn't match what he wanted. I showed you his email. You dismissed it. You're an assistant. Richard's voice rose. You don't have the experience to question senior-level strategy decisions. I had the experience to listen to what the client actually said. You were too bold, too aggressive. You stepped out of line, and now you need to face the consequences. Around the table, the senior executives shifted uncomfortably. But still, not one of them spoke up. Too bold? Shayla repeated slowly. Or too black and too female and too willing to point out when you're wrong? The room went electric. That's completely inappropriate, Richard said, his face reddening. This has nothing to do with what? Race? Let's be honest about what's happening here. Shayla's voice was shaking now, but not with fear. With 3 years of swallowed words finally breaking free. I've worked here for 3 years. I've built relationships with clients. I've saved deals. I've done the work nobody else wanted to do. And the one time I speak up to protect this company from losing everything, I'm too bold. I'm aggressive. I need to know my place. Shayla, do you know what those words mean? What they've always meant when they're aimed at people who look like me? You're out of line. No. Shayla stood up. I'm finally seeing the line clearly, and you're on the wrong side of it. Richard's hand rose, pointing at the door. You're done here, Shayla. Pack your desk. And there it was, the moment we started with. The firing that seemed like an ending, but it was just the beginning. Shayla walked out of that conference room with her head high. She cleaned out her desk while people watched from their cubicles. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply gathered her things and left. That night, her phone rang. Ms. Williams, this is Patricia Chen, General Counsel for Clark Legacy Holdings. Shayla's breath caught. Mr. Clark wanted me to reach out to you personally. He was deeply disturbed by what happened today, and he wanted you to know something. He recorded the entire presentation. He what? It's standard practice for him in major business negotiations. He records everything for his records, which means he has documentation of how you tried to protect that deal, how you were dismissed, and how you were ultimately fired for doing the right thing. Shayla sat down slowly. Ms. Williams, Mr. Clark would like to offer you a position as Director of Ethical Investment Strategy for Clark Legacy Holdings. He needs someone with your integrity overseeing where his money goes. The salary is $180,000, plus benefits and equity participation in our investment fund. Shayla couldn't speak. There's more, Patricia continued. Mr. Clark is a very connected man in this city. What happened to you today? It's not going to stay quiet. He's already made calls to several business leaders he knows. By tomorrow morning, every major financial firm in Tennessee is going to know that Henderson Financial Group fired an employee for trying to protect a client's interests. I don't want revenge, Shayla said quietly. This isn't revenge. This is consequence. There's a difference. What happened next unfolded like dominoes. The story spread through Memphis's business community within 48 hours, not through social media or news articles, but through the quiet, powerful network of phone calls between people who mattered. Other clients started asking questions. If Henderson Financial Group would ignore Mr. Clark's clear instructions, what were they doing with other people's money? Within a week, 3 major clients requested audits of their portfolios. Within 2 weeks, 2 of those clients pulled their funds. Within a month, the company was hemorrhaging money and reputation. But the real revelation came when Richard Henderson's father found out what happened. James Henderson Sr. was 83 years old. He'd built Henderson Financial Group from nothing, working out of a small office in downtown Memphis in the 1970s. He'd officially retired a decade ago, but everyone knew he still paid attention. When he heard what his son had done, he drove to the office personally. The conversation happened behind closed doors, but people heard the raised voices. They heard the old man's fury, and they heard one line clearly. "You didn't just fire an employee, Richard. You fired everything this company was supposed to stand for." James Henderson Sr. called an emergency board meeting. He proposed removing Richard as CEO. The vote wasn't even close. 6 months after that conference room confrontation, the Memphis Business Journal ran a story. Henderson Financial Group announces leadership change after client loss and cultural reckoning. Richard Henderson had been removed as CEO. His father came out of retirement temporarily to stabilize the company. They'd hired a new leadership team committed to what they called values-based investing. And they publicly apologized to Shayla Williams. Not a press release, a personal letter published in full, acknowledging what had happened and what it represented. Shayla read it in her new office at Clark Legacy Holdings. She thought about calling Richard, about rubbing it in, about making him feel even a fraction of what she'd felt. But Miss Loretta's voice was in her head again. "Baby girl, some people teach us lessons by showing us exactly what not to be. You don't need to crush them. Life does that all on its own when people refuse to learn." Shayla folded the letter and set it aside. She had work to do, real work, important work, building something that mattered. So what does all this mean for us today? This story is about more than one woman and one company. It's about something bigger, something we need to talk about honestly. When Shayla Williams spoke up in that meeting, she wasn't just flagging a business problem. She was challenging something deeper. The assumption that people in power always know best. The idea that questioning authority is the same thing as being difficult. And most painfully, the reality that Black women in professional spaces face a trap that's almost impossible to escape. Stay quiet, and you're ignored. Speak up, and you're aggressive. Work twice as hard, and it's expected. Ask for recognition, and you're ungrateful. Show emotion, and you're unprofessional. Stay calm, and you don't care enough. The word Richard used, bold, deserves attention. Because bold isn't actually a bad thing. We celebrate bold leaders, bold innovators, bold visionaries, bold entrepreneurs. But when that word is aimed at a Black woman who dares to speak truth, it transforms. It becomes a weapon. It means, you forgot your place. You're making me uncomfortable. You need to shrink yourself back down to a size I can tolerate. Too bold, too aggressive, too confident, too ambitious. These words have a history. They're descendants of centuries of language designed to keep people in their place. And that place was always beneath, always smaller, always quieter. What happened to Shayla happens every single day across America. A woman sees a problem and speaks up and gets labeled difficult. A Black employee points out bias and gets told they're playing the race card. Someone junior has a better idea than someone senior and gets dismissed because that's not how we do things here. We lose brilliant insights because we're more committed to hierarchy than truth. We lose crucial warnings because we'd rather protect egos than fix problems. We lose talented people because making them feel small seems easier than examining why their presence makes us uncomfortable. And here's the thing that should scare every leader reading this. Shayla was trying to save that deal. She wasn't trying to embarrass Richard. She wasn't playing politics. She wasn't being difficult for the sake of being difficult. She saw a problem that would cost the company everything, and she tried to fix it. And the response wasn't gratitude, it was punishment. Think about what that means. It means Richard valued his ego more than $900 million. He valued being right more than being successful. He valued maintaining power dynamics more than listening to someone who actually knew what she was talking about. That's not just bad leadership, it's self-destruction. But this story also reveals something about the power of consequences. When Mr. Raymond Clark walked out of that meeting, he didn't do it just for himself. He did it because he understood something fundamental. Where we put our money is a statement about our values. Every dollar we spend, every investment we make, every company we support, these are votes. They're declarations about what kind of world we want to live in. Mr. Clark could have overlooked the portfolio problems. He could have focused solely on returns and ignored the fact that those returns would come from private prisons and predatory lending. He could have prioritized profit over principle, but he didn't. Because he understood that wealth built on suffering isn't really wealth. It's just blood money with a better marketing department. And when he offered Shayla that job, he wasn't just rewarding her integrity. He was making a statement about what he valued in the people around him. Courage, honesty, the willingness to do what's right even when it's hard. This is the lesson for anyone in leadership. The people who challenge you aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're the only ones brave enough to tell you the truth. The employees who speak up aren't always being difficult. Sometimes they're trying to save you from yourself. The voices that make you uncomfortable aren't always wrong. Sometimes they're the only ones clear-sighted enough to see what you're blind to. And if your first response to being challenged is to silence the challenger rather than examine the challenge, you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Think about Richard Henderson's father, James Sr. He built a company over 40 years. He survived recessions, market crashes, and countless challenges. He created something meaningful, and his son nearly destroyed it in a single meeting because he couldn't handle being corrected by someone he considered beneath him. James Sr.'s fury wasn't just about the lost deal. It was about watching his son betray everything the company was supposed to represent. Integrity, excellence, respect. When he said, "You fired everything this company stood for," he was speaking a profound truth. Organizations don't just have employees. They have cultures, values, identities, and every decision a leader makes either strengthens or erodes what the organization stands for. Richard thought he was firing one difficult employee. He was actually revealing that the company had become a place where honesty was punished and ego was protected, where speaking truth to power got you shown the door, where your value wasn't determined by your contributions, but by your willingness to stay silent. And once that was revealed, everything else collapsed, because good people don't want to work in places like that. Good clients don't want to do business with companies like that. Good opportunities don't flow toward organizations like that. Here's what we need to understand. Shayla Williams didn't destroy Henderson Financial Group. Richard Henderson did that himself. Shayla just held up a mirror and forced everyone to see what had been there all along. This is the power and the burden that often falls on people who look like Shayla. Black women, in particular, find themselves in this position constantly. They see the problems, they name the dysfunction, they point out the bias, and then they're blamed for the discomfort that follows, as if noticing discrimination creates it, as if naming injustice is worse than committing it, as if speaking up about bias is more divisive than the bias itself. This is what scholars call shooting the messenger, and it happens because acknowledging the message would require change, growth, accountability, and sometimes People would rather fire the messenger than face the message. But here's the hope in this story. Truth has a way of winning eventually. Not always quickly, not always fairly, not without pain and loss and struggle. But eventually, truth wins. Mr. Clark believed Shayla because he'd lived long enough to recognize integrity when he saw it. James Henderson Sr. believed the story because he'd built a company on principles he thought his son understood. Other business leaders in Memphis believed it because they'd seen this pattern before, and they were tired of pretending it didn't exist. The truth spread not through shouting, but through quiet, determined voices saying, "This happened. This was wrong. This matters." And slowly, painfully, the consequences came. This is why representation matters. Why diversity isn't just a buzzword. Why inclusion isn't just about being nice. It's about survival. Henderson Financial Group almost died because it had created a culture where only certain voices mattered, where challenging the boss was more dangerous than losing millions, where protecting pride was more important than protecting the business. That's not diversity failure. That's business failure. And it happens every single day in companies that think they're doing fine because they've never examined who gets to speak and who has to stay silent. Before we wrap up, there's one final truth you need to hear. She smiled. The path I'm on now, the path that started with being fired for telling the truth, has taught me something beautiful. When you refuse to shrink yourself, you give other people permission to grow. When you speak up, you make space for others to find their voices too. At Clark Legacy Holdings, we've built something special, not because we're smarter than anyone else, but because we've committed to a simple principle. Listen to the people closest to the problem, especially when they're telling you something you don't want to hear, especially when they don't look like the people who've traditionally held power. And you know what? We're profitable. We're growing. We're outperforming industry standards. Because it turns out that when you invest in values, you get returns in more than just money. You get loyalty, trust, innovation, purpose. Shayla's voice softened. To anyone in this room who's ever been told they're too bold, too aggressive, too much, you're not. You're exactly enough. And the world needs what you have to offer, even when, especially when, it makes people uncomfortable. To the leaders in this room, the people who challenge you are giving you a gift. Don't waste it by silencing them. Don't throw away wisdom because it comes wrapped in a voice you didn't expect. And to the person who fired me 3 years ago, the room held its breath. Thank you. People gasped. Thank you for showing me that my value isn't determined by your perception. Thank you for pushing me out of a place that was too small for what I was becoming. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us is actually the door opening to something better. I don't say that to be noble. I say it because it's true. That firing hurt. It was humiliating. It was unfair, but it was also necessary. Not because you were right to do it, but because I was ready for something bigger than I knew. Sometimes God uses closed doors to move us toward open ones. Sometimes the people who reject us are actually protecting us from settling. Sometimes being fired from the wrong place is actually being freed for the right one. Shayla took a breath. I'm not telling anyone to be grateful for injustice. I'm not saying we should accept discrimination or celebrate being underestimated. Those things are wrong, and we should keep fighting against them. But I am saying this. Don't let other people's limitations become yours. Don't let someone else's inability to see your value convince you it doesn't exist. Don't let being pushed out of the wrong room make you forget that somewhere there's a right room waiting. Miss Loretta, my grandmother, used to tell me, "Baby girl, you carry yourself with pride." Not pride like arrogance. Pride like dignity. Like knowing who you are and whose you are. Like understanding that your worth isn't up for debate. So to every person in this room who's ever felt too bold, too much, too different, keep going. Your boldness is your strength. Your voice matters. Your perspective is valuable. And somewhere, there's a room that needs exactly what you have to offer. Sometimes it takes being pushed out of the wrong room to find the right one. Sometimes being fired is actually being freed. And sometimes the hardest stories, Shayla smiled through her own tears, are the ones that heal us all. The room erupted in applause. Richard Henderson stood in the back, tears running down his face, clapping harder than anyone. After the ceremony, Shayla stood in the lobby greeting people, business leaders, young professionals, people who'd heard her story and felt seen by it. Then she saw him approaching. Richard Henderson. He walked slowly, like someone carrying weight he couldn't put down. When he reached her, he stopped a respectful distance away. "Ms. Williams, I don't expect you to want to talk to me." Shayla looked at him, really looked at him. She saw something she hadn't seen 3 years ago. Fear, regret, the kind of brokenness that comes from watching yourself destroy something valuable. "Mr. Henderson, I need you to know something," he said quietly. "I was wrong. Not just about firing you, about everything. The way I treated you. The way I dismissed what you were trying to tell me. The way I protected my ego instead of protecting what mattered." He paused, struggling with the words. "I've spent 3 years trying to understand how I became that person. How I turned into someone who'd rather lose everything than admit a black woman knew something I didn't." Shayla said nothing, just listened. "My father, when he pulled me aside after everything fell apart, he said something I can't forget. He said, 'I taught you about business, but somewhere along the way, you forgot about people. You forgot that power isn't about making others small. It's about helping everyone rise.'" Richard's voice cracked. "I lost the company. I lost my reputation. I lost relationships with people I cared about. But the worst part? I almost lost the chance to learn why. I almost stayed comfortable in my wrongness. And watching you up there tonight, succeeding not despite what I did, but maybe because of it, it showed me something." "What's that?" Shayla asked softly. "That grace isn't about pretending harm didn't happen. It's about refusing to let the person who harmed you stop you from becoming who you are meant to be." He extended his hand. "Thank you for being bold. Thank you for speaking truth. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I desperately needed to learn, even though I fought it every step of the way." Shayla looked at his hand for a long moment. She thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the fear, the nights wondering if she'd made a mistake, the weight of being fired and labeled difficult. But she also thought about where she was now, what she'd built, who she'd become. She shook his hand. "Mr. Henderson, I hope you've learned what you needed to learn. I hope you're becoming better. Not for me, I'm good. But for the next person who works for you. For the next voice that challenges you. For the next truth you don't want to hear." "I'm trying," he said quietly. "Every day I'm trying." Shayla nodded. "That's all any of us can do." He walked away, and Shayla turned back to the crowd. Miss Loretta was waiting, her arms open wide. "Come here, baby girl." Shayla fell into her grandmother's embrace, finally letting the tears come. Not tears of sadness anymore. Tears of release, of gratitude, of arriving somewhere she'd been fighting to reach her whole life. "You proud of me, Grandma?" Miss Loretta pulled back and held her granddaughter's face in her hands. "Baby, I've been proud of you since the day you were born. Proud of you when you were struggling. Proud of you when you were fired. Proud of you when you were scared. Pride doesn't wait for success, baby. Pride sees the strength in you even when you can't see it yourself." "I was so scared that day," Shayla whispered. "When he fired me, I thought my career was over." "I thought I'd made a terrible mistake." "You made the only choice you could make and still look yourself in the mirror," Miss Loretta said firmly. "That's not a mistake. That's integrity. And integrity costs, baby, but compromise costs more. It costs you yourself." Shayla hugged her grandmother tight. "Thank you for teaching me to be bold." "Oh, baby," Miss Loretta laughed through her tears. "I didn't teach you that. You were born with that fire. I just made sure nobody put it out." That night, Shayla sat in her apartment overlooking the Mississippi River. The award sat on her table, gleaming in the lamplight. She thought about the journey, about the girl from South Memphis who'd worked overnight shifts to pay for college, about the young professional who'd been told she was too bold, about the woman who'd refused to shrink herself even when staying small would have been easier. She thought about Mr. Raymond Clark, who'd seen her value when others couldn't, about Miss Loretta, who'd planted seeds of dignity that had grown into forests of strength, about all the people who'd said yes to her when one person had said no. But she also thought about Richard Henderson, about the cost of pride, about how easy it is to become the villain in someone else's story when you're not careful about who you're becoming in your own. She'd forgiven him, not because what he did was okay, but because carrying that anger would have been like drinking poison and expecting him to die. Forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about her freedom. Her phone buzzed, a text from one of the young women she'd been mentoring. "I spoke up in my meeting today, like you taught me. I was terrified. But I did it. Thank you for showing me what boldness looks like." Shayla smiled and typed back, "I'm proud of you. Keep speaking. Keep being bold. Your voice matters." She set down her phone and looked out at the river, at the city lights reflecting on the water, at the place that had tried to keep her small and had instead made her strong. This city had taught her that injustice doesn't just break people. Sometimes it breaks them open, opens them up to strength they didn't know they had, opens them up to purpose they couldn't see before, opens them up to becoming bigger than their circumstances. She'd been fired for being too bold, and now she was being celebrated for it, not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because she'd refused to accept that someone else's fear of her voice meant she should stop using it. There would be more fights ahead, more moments of being told she was too much, more rooms that would try to make her smaller. But she knew something now that she hadn't known 3 years ago. Being bold isn't a flaw, it's a superpower, and the right rooms don't want you smaller. They want you whole. Somewhere across town, Richard Henderson sat in his home office staring at a photo of his father. James Henderson Sr. had passed away 6 months ago, but before he died, he'd said something to his son that Richard replayed every day. "Son, I built this company with my hands and my reputation. You nearly destroyed it with your pride, but you still have time to rebuild, time to become the man I hoped you'd be. Don't waste it being bitter about what you lost. Use it to become grateful for what you learned." Richard had that conversation framed on his desk now. He was rebuilding, slowly, consulting for small firms, teaching leadership courses about what not to do, sharing his story, not as a victim, but as a cautionary tale about the cost of unchecked ego. It was humbling work, painful work, but necessary work, because his father was right. He'd lost a company, but he'd gained a mirror. And what he'd seen in that mirror had been ugly, arrogant, blind. But mirrors show you what needs to change. And change, Richard was learning, was possible. Even when it hurt. Even when it meant admitting you'd been wrong about everything. Even when it meant watching someone you'd dismissed become everything you'd prevented yourself from being. He looked at the photo of Shayla from tonight's ceremony in the Memphis Business Journal online. She was smiling, confident, free. He felt something unexpected, not jealousy, not resentment, hope. Because if she could transform pain into purpose, maybe he could too. If she could turn being fired into being freed, maybe he could turn being humbled into being human. It wouldn't erase what he'd done. It wouldn't undo the harm he'd caused. But maybe, just maybe, it could prevent him from causing that harm again. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not a justification, not an excuse, an apology, a real one. Public, honest, accountable. He was finally ready to do what he should have done 3 years ago. Listen, learn, change. It was too late to save what he'd destroyed, but maybe it wasn't too late to build something better from the ruins. Because that's the thing about these stories. They're never really about one person winning and another losing. They're about what we all do with the moments that break us open. Do we let bitterness make us smaller? Or do we let brokenness make us better? Shayla chose better. And in doing so, she didn't just change her own story. She changed everyone watching. Every young black woman who'd been told she was too much. Every person who'd been punished for telling the truth. Every voice that had learned to stay silent because speaking up was too dangerous. She showed them another way. Be bold. Be honest. Be unapologetically yourself. And trust that somewhere there's a room that needs exactly what you have. Richard chose better too. Eventually, painfully, after losing everything. But he chose it. And in doing so, he became proof that people can change. That pride can be broken. That even the person who caused harm can learn to stop causing it. Not to be celebrated, but to be acknowledged. Because if we believe people can't change, we have no reason to keep fighting for justice. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about creating a world where fewer people have to choose between speaking truth and keeping their jobs, where fewer women have to be twice as good to get half as far, where fewer voices are silenced because they make powerful people uncomfortable. That world doesn't exist yet. But every time someone chooses boldness over silence, we get a little closer. Every time someone chooses growth over ego, we get a little closer. Every time someone refuses to shrink themselves, we all grow a little bigger. This story isn't over. It's happening right now, in conference rooms and classrooms and courtrooms across this country. Someone is being told they're too bold. Someone is choosing to speak anyway. Someone is being pushed out of a room that was too small for them. Someone is finding a bigger one. And somewhere, someone is learning that the hardest stories, the ones about being fired, being dismissed, being told you're too much, those stories aren't endings, they're beginnings. Because sometimes, the worst thing that happens to us is actually the door opening to something we never imagined we deserved. Sometimes being fired isn't failure, it's freedom. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted reveals what you actually need. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep being bold, keep speaking truth, keep taking up space, even when the whole world is telling you to be smaller. Because your boldness isn't a problem, it's a promise that things can be different, that voices can be heard, that truth can be spoken, that justice, however slowly, however painfully, however imperfectly, can win. So to everyone who's ever been told they're too bold, keep going. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. Your refusal to shrink matters. And somewhere out there, in a room you haven't found yet, someone is waiting for exactly what you have to offer. Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that heal us all. And your story, it's just beginning.